I did it wrong last time, I hate to say. Can you hear me? You can?
Yes.
There it is. I couldn't hear you for a second. Um, Excellent. I'm sorry to say, I think I messed up that last piece, but that's okay. We were off to it. We're all warmed up now.
Okay.
These conversations, and I always enjoy them so much.
Thank you. Me too.
Um,
Random ravings.
yeah. Well, yeah. With quite a bit of history, though, you have such a great background. Um, something we haven't talked about in a while, but I think it's another interesting. You have quite a somatic background, a Feldenkrais, and I know you've
Oh,
even done some, even I know you've done some Pilates and what's the gyrotonics,
gyrotonic.
gyrotonics. But did you, if I remember, I think you mentioned at one time that you kind of became interested in Feldenkrais uh, as an adjunct to Tai Chi.
Yeah, Feldenkrais, the man was into judo. And when he was developing his methodology, he was also doing teaching martial arts in Israel. And at that time, then he started to do judo and met Kano, who was the founder of judo.
Oh
And
yeah,
he was the first black belt. And they opened a studio in France, and he and his family. And so he based a lot of the movements in his method called Feldenkrais on judo and moving from the lower abdomen, the movement center.
yes.
So based on that, uh, it's a somatic method of education where you experience and explore your body through movement, awareness through movement. And
You know,
then,
you mentioned that moving from the abdomen and and do they in the Japanese judo, of course, is Japanese, and they call that the hara, yeah.
hara, yes.
And uh, of course, that's our first connection uh, to our mother, right? Is the
Yeah.
umbilical connection in our. Do you think that there's any relationship with that umbilical connection and our orientation, our early orientation to the world?
Is that embryology?
Well, it's not really embryology. Actually, the way I think of it is that was our original, certainly nutritional access, and probably a lot of our information was coming that way too,
I
depending on
see.
what we want to classify as information. So it seems, and I also kind of, I think we are in, if you bring up embryology, begin to develop around this. Um, yes, we have the notochord and the black streak that we kind of develop around, but we also have this nutrition that's coming in blood,
Right.
and we're also developing around that nutritional inflow.
Mm, I see. This area I'm not too sure about. See,
Okay. So anyway, it's just something when I think of something like the heart or the umbilicus or the navel or moving from that center, that those
oh,
are some of the things. What about this one? If we take a little different turn, what we often think of, do you think of the Tantian or the Hara as the center of gravity generally?
yeah, that's what they move from the Dantian
Yeah.
and cultivate from the Dantian.
In upright posture, it's certainly the
Yeah,
center of gravity. Yeah.
or even on all fours, or
And there's
rolling and turning over, and also gait movement.
the house gate movement, would you say?
uh, how the pelvis moves, organizes the gait movement.
Yes. Yeah. Um, So was that helpful in your Tai Chi uh,
So
learning?
what was going on was I was meeting these teachers, and sometimes I didn't know enough Chinese to really understand what they were teaching me. So I under what I understood in their words isn't what they were doing in their demonstration in their movement. So I thought I better model their movement and not their words. So to get more, uh, I would say, a vocabulary and also sensitivity to their energy when they move, I use the Feldenkrais method as a reference because the Feldenkrais movements is a kind of vocabulary of movement
Yes.
based on the moving around the dantian.
What a well, I don't know if it was intuitive or not, but what a great insight. To learn um, to develop a movement vocabulary to just study movement. Now that might sound obvious, but I think a lot of people approach movement in other ways,
Yeah,
besides that. And often,
yeah,
that's what we often say, someone's stuck in their head or something like
yeah,
this. It's harder for them to, and I think in classes like that or in arts like that, whatever we want to call that, disciplines like that,
yeah,
we also not in learning to notice things about ourselves and our own movement, we also in turn learn to notice things in others and their movement.
yeah,
And that's part of that observational component you were just referring to.
yeah. And also the mirror neurons, where
Uh,
you're trying to imitate through just using your nervous system to feel and move according to what feels natural and what works in the context, like it's a martial arts context or whatever context you're trying to improve movement and efficiency
yes, yes.
and elegance.
We can do that with ourselves too. Maybe it's not quite mirror neurons, but sometimes if one side is more dominant or it kind of picks things up more rapidly, it can kind
Yeah,
of demonstrate, or we can use that as a way to demonstrate to either
yeah,
the slower side or the injured side.
yeah,
If there's an injury
sure,
that the person's having a difficult time, we can use that crosstalk as a way to kind of rehab.
sure. Yeah, that's right. Because there's a dominant side. The body isn't equal left and right, so there's a dominance in the nervous system,
Uh,
like right side dominance or left side dominance. And it could also be reflected in brain physiology too.
yes, yes.
Learning, the
Uh,
theory of brain centered learning.
right, yeah, kind of like the um, body gym, that kind of thing.
Yeah, brain gym.
Brain
Yeah,
gym, that's it, brain gym.
yeah. That's educational kinesiology.
Educational. And what's kind of the gist of that, if we will?
Educational kinesiology is a kind of a methodology to help people over if they have a certain if their system is kind of goes into a certain level of stress in doing certain activities like reading where the eyes have to cross the midline or movements where you have to cross the midline
Mm-hmm.
coordination and the body gets stressed out. They have this a methodology to help people to move through their stress and and, uh, and be able to overcome their move, neurological and movement uh, obst- obstructions.
Right. That's good. So, in a way, finding a different pathway.
Yeah, neurological pathway or somatic pathway.
Would be like instead of accepting the stuck point, if we if it's entertaining a different route, a different path
Yeah,
that's
yeah,
a different possibility.
yeah.
And
So part of that is kind of the body goes into a kind of stress response. Could be emotional or just a feeling of stress.
mhm.
This helps to overcome that sense of an obstacle.
That's really good. Um, and how did some of the other, did you find any other systems that played really well with the Feldenkrais?
Well, any system that like the gyrotonic or Pilates, they also move from or teach people to move from the movement center in the pelvis. So it also is good for those systems too.
Wasn't there, since we're talking movement, and who knows who would listen to this at some point, um, wasn't there some controversy about how the core was held during some of the movements in Pilates sometime back, 10 years ago? I don't know.
Well, I don't exactly know if there was a controversy or not.
Well, I thought, well, was there a couple of different ways to teach the material? I mean,
Oh,
basically, say locking out the back, I think was probably one. If you some teachers would say maybe flatten out the back while you're lying down.
oh, I see what you
I
mean.
would use that kind of.
The way we were taught is that it should be a natural curve. It shouldn't be a flat
Exactly.
back.
I concur. I concur. But I also had seen that kind of.
Yeah, that was kind of different teachers did it different ways, but our teacher Angela Crowley, she taught us with a natural curve.
Yeah, she was very skilled. I don't know if she's still teaching, but
Yeah, she's still teaching.
is she down in Florida now, maybe, or
Yeah,
something like that? Yeah.
yeah.
Uh-huh. Yeah, she did really well in Colorado and Denver for a long time. Um, did you just study with Angela, or did you do some of the other stuff?
She brought in other famous
She
trainers,
brought in other trainers, yeah.
and
Were from the New York, or were they from New Mexico, or?
can't remember, but we did Polestar Pilates as a
Oh,
methodology
hmm.
that relates to physical therapy
Right. I
and
was just going to say
rehabilitation.
more clinically oriented.
Yeah,
Yeah.
right.
Of course, being a clinician, I like that, but that's
Yeah,
me. Um, and she was also big on or still is, I'm sure, the gyrotonic stuff.
yeah. She teaches gyrotonic.
Yeah, and you've done a lot of the gyrotonic as well.
Well, yeah, I was trained in gyrotonic.
And it has a lot of the circular movements coming from that
Yeah,
center again.
yeah. The spiraling and circular. So the spiraling movements and opening the joints are some kind of qigong, and moving the spine relates to Kundalini yoga and that kind of energy system.
This is in the gyrotonic
Gyrotonic, yeah,
uh, realm
and the breathing,
as well.
yeah,
I don't know that I ever learned any of the gyrot. I've done a few gyrotonic classes, and got some of the basic movement patterns, but I don't remember any instruction around breathing. But
yeah, the
I just did.
different breathing patterns.
I didn't do the training. I just did some classes.
Yeah.
Um, but that's speaking of spiraling and this type of thing. What about some of the ideas and concepts around spiraling in Tai Chi or in internal martial arts?
Well, they do in Tai Chi. They do emphasize spiraling and the movements of the bones and the tendons spiraling as a way to move the energy and move the mind.
So when the Tai Chi practitioner, Tai Chi master talks about bone. Can you how would you describe that?
Uh, they're so when you push down on the feet,
Mhm.
and you can feel a kind of a spiraling in the femur and the bones as you push down, and then the force moves through the spine, and then up into the arms and up into the cranium. So it all spirals in a coordination with the breath.
Mhm. Now, uh, do you think that is that following kind of fascial lines? Do you think?
I think so, yeah.
Yeah. And of course now we depends on who you're talking to, but we can certainly consider bone a form of fascia or certainly
Yeah,
has
that's right.
connective tissue
Connective
elements.
tissue. Yeah,
Yeah. So you do too, at least conversation,
yeah,
you kind of put it in that. And
sure.
so, and again, so that firm anchoring, if you will, of that kind of that densest connective tissue, if we want to say
Yeah,
it that way, that roots us to the ground in a standing position.
yeah,
And so it's really kind of a transference of force.
yeah, that's right.
Yeah. And like, what about the that you talked about undulating movements in gyrotonics? There's also an undulating movement in a lot of the qigong practices.
Yeah, there's certain styles of qigong called tanmigong. It's a Buddhist style of tanmigong. Uses spinal movements to as a kind of basis uh, for their style of qigong.
But
Undulating the spine.
but even but also what even like tucking the pelvis. This is part of that. That just tucking the pelvis isn't undulating by itself, but
Certain styles of qigong and also certain styles of tai chi emphasize the use of the tailbone and bringing the force up through the tailbone, through the spine, and out the arms. It's by flattening the back and turning the tailbone under.
yeah.
That
So
that's how they marshaled the force through their system.
yes, and now I mean, and do you think that is that more of a connective tissue force, or is that
Yeah,
also yeah?
I think so. It's fascial, and
That's a fascial thing when we
yeah,
certainly stretch the back line when we do something like that.
and, it also moves the ligaments. So it's not focusing on muscle; it's focusing on whole body integration,
Uh-huh.
the undulation or the movement of the force through the spine.
I see. But it also, when we start talking about tucking there, and certainly if there's any undulation, that's or breathing, coordinated breathing with that,
Yeah,
that starts to point towards some of the internal
yeah, that's internal.
qigong or
Yes,
um,
internal styles.
yes, or even like in yoga, and this isn't really about yoga, but it's a human body and it has a
Sure,
certain energetic systems that starts to point
sure,
to kind of a kundalini type of access.
sure. Not necessarily Kundalini, it could be, but it definitely is moving chi through the channels, the central channel, and then the Du Mai, which is the governing channel on the spine, and the Ren Mai, which goes down the front. It's
That's
more surface.
that I was just going to ask, how would you make the distinction? So you would make the distinction as Kundalini is more internal rather than superficial or surface energy.
I think it's a kind of a different kind of cultivation because Kundalini is a yoga that they're cultivating a certain kind of spiritual practice, whereas to differentiate that from a martial art, it's the different use of energy and different kind of, maybe you could call it a frequency.
Right. I guess it does still sound very similar to the Taoist cultivation.
Right. Yeah. This is the martial art part is more close to Taoism, but
Uh,
not internal alchemy. This is Tai Chi. This is a martial art or a health, a general health practice.
yes. And as we were saying before, it's more of that um, post heaven
Yeah, it's
cultivation.
post heaven.
We're
Yes.
working with the Constitution. We're,
Yes.
yeah, in a right here, right now kind of
Yeah,
activity.
it's helping the function of the organs, the chi balancing, yin and yang chi balancing in the organs, organ systems, and meridian systems for health purpose.
So that's where a lot of the health benefits come from.
Yeah. Yeah.
You'll see these simplify the studies that notice, that there's increased bone density and things like
Right.
this because
Right.
they're
Yeah.
standing up
Because
and
you're
moving.
putting force through the bones
Mhm.
and putting stress on the bones through the spiraling.
And that's good.
Yeah.
But
That's
there's really a lot of other things that are occurring too if we're moving
sure.
connective tissue and the channels.
Sure.
Those are stimulating a lot of other components of the body and the bioenergetic system, if you want to call
Yeah.
it.
That's
Do
right.
you want to speak to that a little bit as far as like how that, if you stimulate the channels, how that's kind of tonifying, if you will?
Well, I think if you use the word tonifying, it infers that there's some imbalance where there's some place where there's excess and deficiency. So instead of saying tonify, you could say balancing,
Yeah.
where the internal and the external movement of the different channels and circulation are balanced. The balancing of yin and yang. So the Tai Chi symbol
Yes.
with two, like the two fish,
Yes.
Tai Chi symbol, that's a kind of balancing.
Yes. And I know you've talked about, and you could find it, but since we're talking about, there's kind of like an emptying and a filling,
Yeah.
a
In,
contracting or expanding.
in the Tai Chi practice, we do opening and closing, and there's like 9 different of these proverbs, the 9 different properties that need to take place during the course of each Tai Chi movement, like ascending and descending of Chi, and they call it swallowing and spitting, and they call it opening and closing, and empty and full. All these different properties of movement occur during the efficient uh, uh, making of a movement.
And that's what's inferred when they say balance.
Yeah,
To have that. That's
yeah,
what they're
have all those
saying.
properties going. That creates balance, and
Yeah.
it creates power.
And it creates power. Um,
Because it's a martial art.
in,
So you
in,
want
in,
to have a power that expands and contracts.
and from an internal martial art perspective, how's that power generated, or how's that power?
So on the most physical level, you push down on your feet, and you get a rebound of force from the earth through your bones and through your connective tissue up through the body, out through the hands. And then you add to that with using the body efficiently and in a relaxed way, relaxing the muscles, opening the joints, and extending inside the spine, lengthening and extending inside the spine. All these things help the efficiency of the force to move through the system.
Right, because if there's an area that's contracted or tight,
Yeah,
then the person or that person's body is likely to, well, to be imbalanced there and to either collapse under force or
yeah,
necessitate a lot of adaptation, which is
yes,
going to be rather obvious as the force comes in.
yes.
Is that
Yeah, so if, any kind of lesion can create obstruction of the force going through the system, whether it's in the fascial system or in the organs or in the cranial, sacral system, any, or even just muscle from a muscle injury, it can create some obstruction in the force.
so? But that's an interesting point. So with the internal component or the controlling of our intention or the controlling of our imagination,
Yeah,
uh, we can move beyond that in a given moment.
yeah. You open, like there's a cultivation and opening up, and then on a kind of a subconscious or unconscious level, things flow. It's not a conscious thing.
Right, but
If you do the technique properly, then it all flows.
it just flows. Well, that's a great point. What about so initially, if I understand a little bit of some of these things, they were how old is Tai Chi, give or take? I mean, couple,
Maybe 100 or 200 years old in the 1800s, I think.
Tai Chi,
Yang
that's all.
Chuan.
That's it.
I think the Taoists had certain qigong practices, but it wasn't called Tai Chi at the time.
So those go
So
back.
if it, I'm not too sure the history if it goes back before this 1800s, the
Well,
Qing Dynasty.
somehow I thought it went back. Certainly, Dalmo or whatever that goes back quite a ways.
Yeah, but that's not called Tai Chi. That's called Shaolin.
Shaolin. This is more martial arts.
Yeah.
But actually, he wasn't teaching martial arts. He was teaching health to the monks.
No, he taught him martial arts. Shaolin was a health practice and also a martial art, the self-defense.
Uh-huh. Um, the part that I was curious about in reference to this was how do you they're talking about balancing these, like you said, up, down, expand, contract,
Yeah.
lengthening, shortening, all these components. And one way I envision that is being in balance with nature.
Yeah.
So
That's what they say. That's the terminology. It's very abstract for the Western mind.
it is right, but nature has its influence too, right? I mean, a wind
Yeah.
could be blowing north or south, and it could be raining or whatever. But we have these various humidity or dry,
Yeah.
hot,
Weather or time,
time.
space, yeah, direction,
So those influences. This is a
climate.
way of um, on a microcosmic level,
Yeah.
ourself working
Yeah.
within the trying to be in balance with
With
the
nature.
natural
Yes.
world.
With the seasons and the time. And these theories all go back to the Yellow Emperor's Classic of Compendium of Acupuncture and Chinese medicine. Now that goes back to the Han Dynasty, 3,000 years or so. So all those theories were already present at the time.
Yeah, so that's kind of what I guess that's might have been what I was thinking. I knew that there was those theories are quite old actually.
Yeah, yeah. Though that's that's the basis of Taoism and Chinese medicine.
Yes, yes. And certainly the internal martial arts borrow heavily from that.
Sure, that's right, because it's all a Taoist practice or a Taoist philosophy or lifestyle, principles of lifestyle.
Yes, yes, yes. Um, and we had talked a little bit earlier about when you pull in the energy, and you were kind of talked about there's, kind of using the arm as an example and pulling this, and we're like the Wei Chi. But
So it's not a kind of a we're talking about how when one does the practice and the chi starts to become full in the body, then one of the signs that it's full is that the chi can have a course, it can have a route through the pores. So one becomes a kind of it's the somatic feeling is like an emptiness, and chi from the environment or chi from inside the body can move freely in and out of the uh, of of the surface, around the surface of the body.
if I may, what emptiness? What's empty?
Well, the sense of fullness is the feeling that you're full. At the same time, there's nothing obstructing the flow of energies. So that's a kind of feeling of emptiness.
Uh-huh. Kind of a way wu
It's a
way.
fullness, but an emptiness. It's not a deficiency emptiness.
Uh-huh.
It's a fullness emptiness. And this fullness is not a pathology, it's health, or it's a fullness of energy.
Yes, yes. I see. Well, that's really good. That takes me away a little bit from the yeah, 'cause that's a lot to think about. Um, what about some specifics around the I know you've called that like the hip or the quad. What is that basically the hip when
Hip
we talk
joint.
about?
The hip joint is the in Chinese called the qua. So it's the inguinal groove is the
Mm-hmm.
location that you feel the hip, the where the femur comes into the joint to the pelvis,
Mm-hmm.
and the location you feel that is in the inguinal groove.
Because it's a little different when you see some of the Tai Chi posture, then actually opposite of what you would think for a lot of, say, lifting movements or other dynamic type movement where you may want to have uh, some curve or extension in the lumbar spine.
So in this case, the lumbar spine is flexible. So so the idea is that you flatten the spine, and this flattening is on the internal side, the medial side is connected to the diaphragm. So it's organizing the diaphragm, the movements of the diaphragm, the pelvic floor. And so this is called the Mingmen or the gate of life point. It's like L5, L3, somewhere in there. But anytime you move these flexion and extension of this, it influences the pelvic floor, it influences the whole diaphragm. And then if you add breathing to it in a coordinated way, then it makes the whole body more coordinated and the chi to be more full and to move force through the whole system.
Yes.
How's that?
That's great. That's great. Yeah, I mean, because we in the West, I think we talk about core and things like this.
Yeah, that's the core.
It is the core. It's just a different. It's just a little different angle of view in applying how to the Western mind, a
Sure.
different angle of view as to how to use the core.
So the point of the hip joint is that you have to use the hip joint in a certain way so that the muscles around the hip joints stay relaxed, but supportive of the posture. And at the same, so this relaxation inside the hip joint allows the flow of energy to pass through the joint. If the tendons or the muscles are too tight, they won't have a flow. It will obstruct the flow. And this is one. This joint, the hip joint, is one of the most emphasized and important uh, methodologies in this style of Yang style Tai Chi to make the flow go from the feet up through the spine into the cranium and the hands. It has to get the hip joint.
It makes sense. Yeah. I mean, just from just simply anatomically, kinesiologically, it makes sense to transfer force. It's a huge joint. And
yes.
it's where the force comes into the pelvis, which then kind of is the conduit for force into the spine.
Right.
So, and then through the arms, or if you want to say into the torso, however we want to say it. But maybe there's not real, maybe we want to avoid force into the spine, but force into the core.
Well, the force comes from the feet through the bone and the connective tissue, because you're pushing down on the earth, and there's a reflective force, a reactive force that is pushed back through the system and out the hands and through the top of the head.
And yet there's a lot of variation or that can be done, I don't want to say coarsely because it's not really coarse, but you can intentionally create a wrap or a tension, a fascial tension.
Yeah.
Kind of like a rebound, like an elastic tension within the fascial system. And then there's also, you've shown me just where there's like a loading of sorts that occurs
loading.
by just being in alignment.
Yeah, that's right. It's an alignment with loading and compression.
Mm-hmm.
Compression through the bones.
And that's different than just necessarily kind of creating I guess an elastic wrap, because elasticity is this kind of recoiling. Is how I'm thinking of the term.
Well, when you are organized well, then there's elasticity through the system, because because you're opening the joints and the chi is moving through all the joints in a flowing way. This is a somatic experience.
Yeah.
Hard to describe, but we're describing the mechanics of the somatic experience.
Right. And that's what you were saying with this flowing and this emptiness. That's another description of the somatic experience.
Right.
Are there a couple of other bits of somatic experience that you'd like to that are common to Tai Chi or internal arts that maybe are easily glossed over or confusing for the Western mind?
Well, so there's chi and blood or fluids, and chi and fluids. The fluids and the blood kind of, you can feel those easier when they're flowing because you feel heat coming out your hands, and that's what they call chi, or a spirit coming out the eyes. That's a kind of a spirit chi coming out the eyes. They call shen. So all these properties are involved with the activity of doing the movements.